Welcome everyone to the Langley Adams Library Town Hall. Today we have Tess Gerritsen, who is here to talk with us about her latest book, which is actually coming out December 30th. This whole project came about because of our Mystery and a Cup of Tea book group, reading Harvest, and thought we would try to contact Tess, and fortunately and luckily she decided she'd come, so it was a wonderful thing. And so just a little bit about Tess. In 1987, her first novel was published. Call After Midnight, a romantic thriller, was followed by 8 more romantic suspense novels. She also wrote a screenplay, Adrift, which aired as a 1993 CBS Movie of the Week starring Kate Jackson. Tess's first medical thriller, Harvest, was released in hardcover in 1996, and it marked her debut on the New York Times bestseller list. Her suspense novels since then have been Life Support, Bloodstream, Gravity, The Surgeon, The Apprentice, The Sinner, Body Double, Vanish, The Mephisto Club, The Bone Garden, The Keepsake, Keeping the Dead Ice Cold, and The Killing Place are the UK titles. The Silent Girl, and now Last to Die. Her books have been translated into 37 languages, and more than 20 million copies have been sold around the world. In July of 2010, TNT premiered its new series, Rizzoli and Isles, based on the best-selling series by Tess Gerritsen. Boston detectives Rizzoli and medical examiner Maury Isles, good friends and sometimes partners, together solve crimes and bust some of Boston's most notorious criminals. As a novelist and doctor, Gerritsen's specialty is in translating complicated medical science for lay readers. Her books have been top 5 bestsellers in the New York Times and abroad. She has won both the Nero Wolfe Award for Vanish and the Reader Award for The Surgeon. Critics around the world have praised her novels as pulse-pounding fun, scary and brilliant, and polished, riveting prose. Publishers Weekly has dubbed her the medical suspense queen. Now retired from medicine, she's writing full-time. And her next book is coming out December 30th, Die Again. I'd like to welcome Tess Gerritsen.
Hi, it's actually only a 3-hour drive from Camden, Maine. So, and the weather isn't too bad, so I was very, very happy to accept. You know, libraries have always meant a lot to me. When I was growing up, I spent most of my childhood in the San Diego Public Library branch near my house. And just last year I did a public library tour of Indiana. I think it was like 20 libraries in 2 weeks. And because I just feel that this is where so many of us learn to love books, and where so many readers have turned into writers. It's in their public library. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here, and now keep in mind that I am open to any questions towards the end. You can ask me anything. I'll even tell you my weight. And also there, Jabberwocky has some books for sale there. I brought also in it some of my early romance novels, and I thought if you buy a book from Jabberwocky, you can get a free romance novel. Just go in that box and go digging around and pick one out. And I also have some bookmarks there for my new story. That's coming out December 30th. I know that what people really like to hear are the stories behind the stories. Where do you get these ideas from, and how do you come up with these sometimes really gruesome, horrifying thoughts? I'll address that last question first, because I know a lot of you came to see how normal I was. And I hear that story. You seem perfectly normal to me. And I am. The reason I tend to gravitate towards dark subjects is that my mother was an immigrant from China. And she didn't understand English very well. But what she loved and what she understood was the American horror film. And I was dragged to every scary movie that Hollywood ever made, and my brother and I spent many happy hours screaming in movie theaters. And I came up with this, I realized then that the height of entertainment was to scare your audience. And I think that I've taken that to heart and have always wanted to give you that same experience of my screaming in movie theaters, because it was great fun. But there was another thing that happened to me when I was younger. We had a beloved family friend, a man who was about 6 years older than me, and he and his mother used to come visit our house all the time, because his mom was my mom's best friend. And kindest, gentlest man you could know. He taught me how to sew, he helped me with my homework, he was just a wonderful, wonderful person. And then when I turned 18, he was arrested for murdering his sister-in-law. He drowned her in the toilet, and he went to jail. And after that, I thought, I don't trust myself anymore. I don't trust my ability to tell whether somebody is actually good. I don't think that a lot of us are really able to tell. And I think there's a lot of stuff that's hidden behind a normal-looking face. And this is really the key to what I'm writing now. It is, what is the real person behind the mask? And that's really what mysteries are all about. It's what thrillers are all about. Who are these real people? Because even somebody I loved and adored turned out to be a killer. I can imagine where it's easy to marry somebody and you don't really know who they are. So I think that this has been the theme throughout my writing career, is who are these people really? So that's sort of the background of why I choose dark materials. But where do I get these materials from? It's easy. The newspapers, conversations, magazines. You know, you probably hear stories all the time that make you go, huh, I wonder what's the real story behind that. And as an example, I mean, I read probably 4 newspapers a day, just because I love to read newspapers. I make it a point of picking up the National Enquirer every week. You know, I'm not too proud. I read Let People magazine because these are stories of real people happening in this country or even abroad. And I've discovered that, you know, again, there's crime stories in there. There's stories about, for instance, Kansas City. The serial killer turned out to be a dog catcher. You know, it's not that unusual, actually. So here's an example. Got this out of the Boston Globe a number of years ago. A real story about a woman who's found dead in her bathtub. The police find empty pill bottles, and they all decide it must be an accidental overdose. So they zip her into a body bag and send her off to the morgue. And a couple of hours later, she woke up in the body bag. And she recovered and went home, and I mean, everything was fine. It wasn't an overdose. But I don't know about you, I thought, when I read that, how often does this happen? So I do the next thing, which most of you would do, if you're curious, is you kind of do a little Google search. I did it in LexisNexis, and the terms I used were mistaken for dead. And I found story after story after story of people who had been mistaken for dead. There was a kid who was, his death certificate had just been signed when the nurse noticed he was breathing. There was a young man found who got hit by a car in Atlanta, spent the night in the morgue refrigerator before somebody heard him moving. My literary agent who grew up on Nantucket, when I told her these stories, she said, oh, that used to happen on Nantucket all the time. I said, what? She said, okay. In Nantucket, apparently, they had a nursing home, and the medical director, the doctor who was in charge of declaring you dead, was deaf. So they'd call him up and they'd say, Mrs. Jones appears to have passed away. And he'd put a stethoscope on Mrs. Jones's chest, wouldn't hear the heart, and send him off to the morgue. And 3 people woke up in the morgue in 1 year. So Nantucket used to call its morgue the House of Rejuvenation. And then the best story, well, maybe the most horrifying story I heard, came out of New York City. A man was on the autopsy table. A pathologist was about to cut him open when the dead man woke up. And the pathologist was so shocked he had a heart attack and died. So, you know, these are the stories you think, wow, it happens. What do I do to turn this into a book? And, you know, you take this kernel of an idea, patient wakes up in morgue, and 10 different authors are going to take it in 10 different directions. You know, if you write horror, you might say, well, it's a vampire. You know, the vampire just woke up. If you're a spy novelist, you'll say, well, Jason Bourne faked his death, and that's him. So what did I do? Well, I already had a character named Dr. Maura Isles, a medical examiner, and I had this woman wake up in the morgue. Maura hears a noise, she zips open the body bag, woman's eyes pop open, Maura goes and calls 911, and they send this woman over to the hospital for her to recover. And while she's over there, she does something nobody expects. She grabs the gun from a security guard, she kills him, and she takes hostages. And among the hostages she takes is a really pregnant homicide detective named Jane Rizzoli. So it becomes a hostage crisis. So that's the direction I took it in, but you get any writer and they're all going to take it in their own personal direction. That's where the art of storytelling comes in. We all have the same ideas hitting us all the time because we're all reading the same newspapers, but you can take the same idea and make it something really, really special. So I get my ideas from, as I just said, from newspapers. Sometimes I get my ideas from conversations, and if you read Harvest, you may know that I got that idea from a conversation with a homicide detective. He had been traveling in Russia and he heard that children were disappearing from the streets of Moscow. And they told him they thought these kids were being sent to the Middle East as organ donors, cut open, sacrificed, and I remember feeling really horrified because I have 2 kids and they were about the right age at that point to be organ donors. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I remember calling my brother-in-law, who was working for Newsweek at the time, and he was about to leave for Russia. He came home a couple weeks later and he said, if it's happening, it's the Russian mafia, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. So I was still thinking about it, and I thought, this is a book. I've got to write this book, and that's how Harvest came about. Now, what I learned from that experience is that the stories, the ideas that stick with you, that give you an emotional punch, those are the stories that you need to write. My books are not intellectual puzzles. They're really all about things that bother me, about kids being sacrificed or bodies waking up. They're things that I can't stop thinking about, and they become stories. Sometimes I get stories, I get ideas because of interest, and I think that writers are really curious people. I mean, we have a lot of different interests. We ask a lot of questions about a whole range of things, and that leads us to stories. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was actually an anthropology major. I wanted to be an archaeologist. All through the years, I have been interested in Egyptology. And I got to having email conversations with this one Egyptologist who has an organization called the Mummy Consortium. It sounds very weird, but what he does is he arranges for Egyptian mummies in the US to get a CT scan. We have about 400 mummies in this country. Most of them came over during the Victorian era when tourists would go to Egypt and they could buy a mummy for $15. And they would ship it home, and they would be kept in parlors, they would end up in attics, and we had one end up in an antique store in Maine, and nobody knew where that mummy came from because there was no history of it. And in fact, King Ramses the Great ended up in Niagara Falls. I don't know how many of you know this. He actually ended up in Niagara Falls at a Ripley's, believe it or not. And then I guess they had some Egyptologists look at him and say, oh my God, this is a royal. Who is this man? And they repatriated him back to Egypt. So there was a day when this Egyptologist called me one day and he said, we're about to CT scan a mummy in Poughkeepsie. Do you want to come? So I thought, sure, I'm going to go down there. So I drove down to Poughkeepsie, and this mummy had been in a museum down there and had never been really studied. So they put the mummy into a van and drove it over to the local hospital. Mummies are scanned in the same hospital CT scans that you and I are scanned in. And so this mummy was put on a gurney and rolled through the lobby of this hospital to the X-ray department. And of course, everybody standing around is going, this patient came in a little late. So they get to the X-ray department, and just to show you the background on how much fun it is to do the research, I'm standing there in the X-ray department, and I'm listening to the conversation of all these people who had arranged the CT scan of the mummy, and found out that it had taken months to get this arranged. The doctors wanted to do it, the museum wanted to do it. The reason it took months was the hospital attorney. The attorney said, in this country, we have what are known as HIPAA rules. And the HIPAA rules demand patient confidentiality. And this patient cannot sign the consent form. So they couldn't get around the HIPAA rules, and finally what the museum did was, we're the parents. So they signed a consent form on behalf of their child, the mummy. So they got this mummy on the CT scan, and this is something I didn't know. I'm a doctor and I didn't know this, but before you start a CT scan, you have to fill out this patient information for the computer to get going. And one of the things that the patient information asks is, what is the gender of this patient? And on this program, there are 3 choices: male, female, and other. And so the CT scan is going, please can I put other? I've never been able to put other before. So they put other, and then they wanted to know the patient's age. And the Egyptologist said, well, we think it's about 2,000 years. So they tried that. That didn't work. So they put down that this mummy was a day old and sent it through. And as you're watching the CT scan, here I am, I'm having such a good time. I'm there really kind of curiosity, not because I'm a writer, but I want to see what's going on here. And so you go through the scan, and you see as it's going through the head that their brain has been taken out, as they did in ancient Egypt. And I'll tell you later how they actually took those brains out. And they get down to the chest, and of course there's just a little tiny bit of what we call the mediastinum, the shriveled up part of the heart is still in place where it should be. And then all the abdominal organs had been removed and wrapped in and dried out and wrapped in linen and were put back into the abdomen. And then we get down to the thigh, and this is where everybody went, oh, because nobody knew anything about this mummy. He was still wrapped up. I mean, he'd never really been examined before. He had a thigh bone that was cracked. I mean, just snapped in 2. And we all said, oh, well, maybe this is the cause of death, because there was no sign of healing. This mummy fell off a horse, or had some kind of a broken thigh bone and bled into his thigh, and that's why he died. So anyway, while I'm watching the CT scan, the writer's mind is always going, and I'm thinking, what if we saw something that nobody can explain, something that nobody is expecting? What if we saw, deep buried in the muscle of this dead person, a bullet? What would you think about that? I mean, obviously it's not an ancient mummy anymore. It's a modern murder victim, and somebody's mummified it. So that ended up turning into a book, and it was because I was curious. I wanted to go watch a CT scan of a mummy, and this idea came about. Well, there's a coda to the stories. I wrote the book. It's called The Keepsake. And I became friends with another Egyptologist named Bob Breyer, and I told him about my book, and I said, yeah, I don't think this has ever been used before in fiction, modern day murder victim turned into a mummy. And he said, well, maybe not in fiction, but it's been done in real life. Turns out that Dr. Breyer was called to a museum in India. And the Indian museum said, we were about to buy a mummy from a private dealer, and we've seen the mummy, and it really bothers. There's something wrong with this mummy. Can you come and take a look? So Dr. Breyer flies out to India, looks at the CT scan of the mummy, and he said, oh, first of all, it's a really bad mummification job. It was not done well. But the thing that really bothered him was it was a young woman, and her teeth had been pulled. And he said, this would never be done in ancient Egypt. So his diagnosis, and he called the police, he said, I believe this is a modern murder victim. And they pulled her teeth to hide the fact she had had dental work. And it did turn into a homicide investigation. And I think I remember him saying it was a family who had killed a female member. It was an honor killing. And then they thought, well, let's make some money off her. So they tried to mummify her and sell her to a museum, which is like the weirdest thing ever. But anyway, after Dr. Breyer said that, he said, yeah, I mean, you think you came up with some new idea, but somewhere there's some criminal who's come up with the idea before, and as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. But that's an example of where you go, you follow your interests, and you come up with some crazy idea. You have no idea where your curiosity is going to take you. The other thing I find is really, really good for writers is travel. I love to travel. I love to go to new places. And a couple of years ago, my husband and I went on safari in South Africa. We went to a lovely lodge, and every day there were game drives. And I don't know how many of you have ever been on safari, but the one thing they tell you when you land in your bush is they say, when you're in the Jeep, don't get out. Stay in the Jeep. Because if you are anywhere near a dangerous animal, if they see you in the Jeep, they think you're all one big animal. They won't bother you. But once you get out, they see that you're prey and they can attack. And as an example, our bushranger, he said, a couple of months before at another lodge, there had been 2 tourists from China who did not understand the instructions. And they went to look at some lions, and these two tourists jumped out and to take pictures, and the lions killed them. And that was, it was emphasized to us that we must always follow the guide's orders, and we must also always stay in the Jeep. So in the evenings, he would stop at a clearing, and we'd get out and have cocktails. It was a very civilized safari. And there was one evening when we stepped out. It was a beautiful clearing on top of a mountain, and so we're all out. There's like 6 of us tourists. We're all standing around, and they poured like gin and tonics. And my husband says, "I gotta go use the bathroom." He says, "I'm gonna go behind that bush over there." And our guide said, "Why don't you go in the other direction? Because I've got some radio report of down in that valley somebody had seen a leopard." My husband says, "Okay." So he goes off in the other direction. And I tell you, 10, 15 seconds later, out of the bush my husband was originally headed for, a leopard walks out. And we are all out of the Jeep, holding our cocktails. What do we do now? And the leopard walks toward us. And our guide, big Afrikaans guy, of Dutch extraction, he just shouts, "Everybody freeze!" And he walked over between us and the leopard. He just stood in front of the leopard like this. He's a big guy. And the leopard just looked at him and thought, "Oh, no," and then turned around and walked back into the bushes. So then we all scrambled into the Jeep. But I thought, this man not only probably saved my husband's life by sending him in the other direction, he also was willing to put himself in a position of danger to make sure that his 6 tourists got out of there alive. We owed our lives to him, and we had to completely trust in him and believe in what he was telling us. And then, okay, now the thriller writer's mind comes in, and I thought, what if he's not who he said he was? What if the guy who met us at this remote bush strip is an imposter, killed the real guide, and he's just come to pick up his Jeep of new victims? Because this is what he does. So that was kind of what started the idea for Die Again. I was going to read a little bit of it, but you know what? I think I'd rather just kind of talk and answer questions, unless you want to hear some later. So I started with this idea of a group of tourists go into, I use Botswana because Botswana is really much more remote and wild. They go for the safari of a lifetime. They fly in from all over the world, they show up in the bush, and they're never seen again. And then 6 years later in Boston, a series of murders is happening, and they seem to be related to hunting. And Jane Rizzoli and Maura Isles finally follow the clues and realize it all relates back to these missing tourists back in Botswana 6 years ago. And they have to find the one person, the one woman, who may be able to know the answer to all this. So that's the genesis behind Die Again. And it's something I picked up overseas. Wasn't really thinking about writing a book, but you get into these situations and you pay attention to what you're afraid of, and that becomes the story. Now I know some of you watch the TV. How many of you watch the television show? Okay, well I'm going to talk a little bit about Rizzoli and Isles, which has just been renewed for its 6th season. Some years ago, I got this call from a Hollywood producer named Bill Haber, and I didn't know who this guy was, but he said, "I've been reading your books, and I love your girls, and I think they belong on television." So he wanted to option the rights to turn it into a TV show, Rizzoli and Isles. And I've sold almost all my books to Hollywood, but nothing ever happens. Or if it does happen, I don't find out about it until years later. I'll talk about that too. So I said, okay, we'll do an option. So he optioned it. I signed it. I got the check. It was good. And I walked away and I forgot about it. And this is the key to staying sane, I think, when you deal with Hollywood, is to cash the check, walk away, and forget about it, because the chances are nothing will happen. So a year later, Bill calls me up and he said, we've got a really good screenwriter named Janet Tamero. She's written a pilot episode, and we're going to take it to TNT. And I thought, fine. And then I just didn't even think about it, because I'm of the opinion that things always fall apart. I guess I'm really pessimistic when it comes to Hollywood. Things always fall apart. So then a month later, he said, TNT has approved it. Now they want to go look for the cast. And I said, okay. Again, still pessimistic. And then he called me and said, we have found our Jane Rizzoli. Well, let me describe Jane Rizzoli from the books. From the books, Jane is, she's got like frizzy hair, she's short, she's frumpy, she's not particularly attractive, she's mad all the time because the men ignore her and they always look at that gorgeous woman, and Jane's smart, but she's also a little prickly. Basically, she is an ordinary looking woman. And he said, Jane Rizzoli is played by Angie Harmon. And you know, I've seen Angie in person. She's more beautiful in person than she is on television, I swear. So I thought, okay, so Jane is no longer ugly. Jane is now beautiful and 6 feet tall. And then they went to cast the part of Maura Isles. Now in the books, Maura is, in my mind, she looks like Catherine Zeta-Jones with kind of a bobbed hair, very serious and very dark. And they tried a lot of actresses on screen tests, but they found that there was one who had chemistry with Angie on screen, and that was Sasha Alexander. So when they decided to write the scripts, I remember Janet Tamaro saying, who do you think your characters really are? I mean, she said, I read these characters and I feel that Maura Isles has Asperger's syndrome. And I thought about it, I thought, you know, you're kind of right, actually. I hadn't really put her in a category, but I think you're kind of right. She said, well, here's the other thing I want to tell you, and I believe it's true. She goes, you have really written about Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. And I thought about that some more, and I thought, oh my God, she's right. Because Jane Rizzoli is Captain Kirk, you know, full of vim and vigor and follows his instincts and just kind of leads by emotion. And then there's Maura, who believes in science, who's much more like Mr. Spock. And I think that was the model they were kind of going for when they started the first season's episodes. So I was first of all, I was very surprised that it went to pilot at all. I was shocked when it was picked up to be a series, and now 6 years later, it's like, wow, I can't believe this really happened. The exciting news is that it's going to go in syndication next year, so you'll be able to see it on the weekends on CBS now. You don't even need TNT anymore. But that's sort of the history behind Rizzoli and Isles, and who knows how long it's going to go. And I want to leave time for questions, but I was going to just address one more thing, because I know there's some copies of Gravity over there. How many of you heard about my lawsuit? Okay, a few of you have heard about my lawsuit with Warner Brothers, which was very painful, because Warner Brothers also produces Rizzoli and Isles. People ask me, what is your favorite book? The book that you love the most, the book that you're proudest of, and I always say Gravity. I wrote that in 1998. It was published in 99. And in 99, I sold the film rights outright to a division of Warner Brothers. And the book is basically about a female medical doctor astronaut who gets stranded aboard the International Space Station when the rest of her crew is killed through a series of accidents. And she is not allowed to come home. She's left in quarantine because a biohazard has spread on the space station. So New Line Cinema bought it. They got a good script out of it. And in the process of developing that, I wrote an extra 14 pages because they weren't happy with the third act of that script. They said it wasn't exciting enough. So I included some scenes where satellite debris destroys the International Space Station, and my female astronaut is left alone drifting in space in her spacesuit. Okay, that film never got made. And then about 10 years later, here comes the movie Gravity, which has a lot of similarities. And I thought, well, you know, there are such things as coincidences. I'm willing to let that pass, until I got some information just this last February that the person who was hired to direct my film in the year 2000 was Alfonso Cuarón, the same person who wrote and directed the movie, Gravity. So that's when I thought, now this is no longer a coincidence. We have the same man who wrote the movie, who was supposed to direct my film about 10 years earlier, and now claims that it's entirely original. He's never heard of me. So that's the basis of the lawsuit. But the film Gravity, the book Gravity, I just want to talk a little bit about that, because it is my favorite book. And again, just a little bit about research and how I go about my research. I write about topics that are not necessarily my background. I mean, I have science in my background, but I also explore things that are really not in my own sphere of familiarity. So I got this interesting idea because of an accident aboard the Mir space station. This happened, I think, in '97. I don't know how many of you remember when Mir was still up there. There was an accident when they tried to do an experimental redocking with a resupply module. It went awry. There was a collision. Mir began to spin out of control. The reports we were hearing was that the three-man crew was not evacuating. And I remember my husband saying, I think there are 3 dead men up there. I think that's the problem. And I got this like horrible feeling because I thought, if they're dead or they're dying, we can hear them take their last breaths because the communications are still up. And what is it like for you to have a loved one up there in orbit and you can't help them, you can't save them, and you can hear them die? It's like horrible. And the same scenario happened not around that same time of the mountain climbers who died up in the Himalayas. Remember that movie, not the book, Into Thin Air by John Krakow? That was the situation. Climbers go up, weather comes in, they all know they're going to die. They cannot be rescued. And one of them takes out his satellite telephone to call his wife to say goodbye. And that was a heartbreaking last conversation because the last thing he said to her was, go to sleep now, my darling, don't worry too much. And that was it. That was the last she heard of him. And I remember thinking about that and really feeling so tearful about the bravery of this man. And it was the same situation that was happening aboard Mir. I thought, here are these people who are dying, and what about their loved ones? You know, what is it like to be somebody on Earth who can't save them? So I pitched this story to my editor. I said, you know, I really want to write a book about the last goodbye. And I'm going to put it aboard the International Space Station because Mir was about to come down. And at that point, ISS had not really been launched yet. It was like a couple of years into the future. And she said, great, this sounds like a good book. Go ahead for it. Go ahead. And then I thought, oh, shit. Now I have to know what I'm writing about. Aside from following the space program and having known Sally Ride in college, I mean, what do I know about space? I know as much as anybody who reads the newspapers. So then I had to embark on 5 months, at least 5 months, of nothing but research. And that, it started off with just reading about astronaut training and ISS and the shuttle program. And luckily, NASA at that time, this was pre-9/11, NASA had everything up on their website. I was able to download 2,000 pages of their shuttle and ISS manuals, operations manuals. So you could find out, you know, if you want to get this little rocket over here to fire, this is the button you push. You know, this is everything. And then, but then you get to the point where, okay, now I know how everything is supposed to go right because this is what the manuals are. The manuals say, you do this, you get this to happen. How do you make things go wrong? I don't know. So now I needed to talk to somebody. And I picked up the phone, and I called Johnson Space Center, and the conversation went something like this. I called their public affairs officer, and I said, hi, I'm a thriller writer, and I'm writing a book about a disaster aboard the International Space Station. Can you help me? And he said, tell me what goes wrong in your book. And I said, well, the whole crew dies except for my heroine. And he said, do you know the purpose of my office here? It's to make our organization look good. I said, tell me what else goes wrong in your story. And by this time I'd sort of plotted it out, and I said, well, a shuttle crashes on landing, killing everybody aboard. And he said, I don't think that NASA wants to cooperate on this. And I said, wait. Everything that goes wrong in this story is not your fault. NASA does everything right. And he said, well, whose fault is it? And I said, it's the military's. And he said, when would you like to come? Because one thing my research does, and this is my anthropology background, is I look into the culture of the people, the tribe I'm about to enter. And the tribe of NASA is that most of these are civilian engineers, civilian space nuts who grew up on Star Trek and Star Wars. And there is an inherent tension between them and military. NASA believes, like Star Trek, space is for all of mankind. Air Force thinks it's for our killer satellites and nobody else's. So, you know, there's that tension, and there's also the dollar tension. They are fighting for the same tax dollars. NASA thinks that we should be using our money for research. Military thinks we should be using our money for warfare. So that really helped me, you know, understand what the mindset was of these. I wanted to write about civilian NASA. So I get down to Johnson, and you drive into their parking lot, and the first thing you look at around is you see the people who work here. by their bumper stickers. And the bumper stickers are all like, beam me up, Scotty. You know these people. They're my people. I mean, I grew up with them in Star Trek. So I spent a week there, spent a week at Canaveral. I was able to talk to engineers about my mission there was, how do I make things go wrong? How do I make a shuttle crash? And you know, of course, they're engineers. They think they've thought of everything, and they say, well, you know, we have backup system after backup system. We don't know how you can make a shuttle crash. So then I said, well, okay, here's a scenario. Everybody on the crew is unconscious. Can you land that shuttle? Because I just assume that everything's computerized. They should be able to do it. And the flight director kind of paused and he goes, no, we can't. So that is actually our worst nightmare, is that something goes wrong up in orbit. They all die, we can't bring it home, and it's a flying coffin for months. And it's a reminder that we've failed. So I said, well, why can't your computers do it? He said, because you need a physical hand. You need a hand to flip 3 switches. One is to flip the switch that starts the deorbit burn to get it out of orbit. And then as it's coming in, you need somebody to flip another switch to launch what they call their air data probes to help the shuttle, line up on the runway. And then he said, and then there's a final switch to lower the landing gear. So my scenario was that my shuttle was going to crash on landing, and my astronauts needed to be intact enough for an autopsy scene, which I was planning after that. So I told him, you just answered my question. My crew goes unconscious between the 2nd and the 3rd switch. Shuttle is there, about to land. Nobody lowers the landing gear. It crashes, but it's not such a horrific crash that I don't have intact bodies. And I told him, I said, thank you. He said, we never think of things like this. But it's the kind of thing where sometimes you just have to talk to the people who know, intimately their subject matter. And yet, even though they work there, they come up with all kinds of, what-if scenarios. You can still come in fresh from the outside and point out things that, maybe they're hazards they're not even aware of. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why people who work too long in one sphere, they need an outsider to come in and look things over and say, well, did you think about this? Because very often they don't. So that book came out in 1999. My goal with writing the book Gravity was that I would write a book that no NASA engineer could find anything wrong with. Trust me, this is really tough because I'm dealing with a whole new language. I mean, in NASA, it's also called the National Acronym Slinging Agency. They don't talk like we do. They have a foreign language. And in fact, people in one building don't use the same acronyms as people in the next building. So they have to have like translators between departments at NASA. But a couple of months after the book came out, I got this call from an engineer. He said, I work at Johnson Space Center. I read your book, and I just want to tell you, you got something wrong. And I hate those calls, but I said, so, what did I get wrong? And he said, well, in this chapter here, you had your hero drive into the Building 30 parking lot and park his car. I said, yeah? And he said, I've worked here 20 years. There's never been an empty space in that lot. So that turned out to be a very, very nice phone call. But anyway, that's an example of how, when you write, you're just dealing with so many wonderful ideas and so many sources, and then you get to play and go off to Johnson Space Center and learn how to fly a rocket, and then you get to go to Africa and do this. And so I just can't imagine really a better profession for somebody who just is curious. And now I'm curious about whether you have any questions. If anybody, you can ask anything. Yes?
How did you end up moving from the West Coast to Maine?
I got there via Hawaii. It's a very strange thing. I met my husband in medical school in San Francisco. And his family lived in Hawaii. So we lived in Hawaii for 12 years, and I got what we call island fever, where you can't stand being on the rock anymore. It was like, get me off this rock. So we went to Maine one summer, and I fell in love with it. It was summertime, first of all. And I just thought this is a great place for a writer. It turns out Maine has a lot of writers. So my dear husband, who is a medical doctor, he's willing to pick up roots, and I just wrote in Maine, and he had a private practice there. So we've been there for 25 years now. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Have you used your medical degree in medicine?
Oh, yeah. I did practice medicine for about 5 years in Honolulu. But about that time, I also had 2 kids. So I decided I wanted to stay home with my kids for a while, and writing was a great way to combine motherhood with a career. And then pretty soon after I started selling books, it became clear that I was actually going to do better as a writer, you know, economically. Yes?
Have you always been interested in writing?
Yeah, you know, if you talk to most writers, you'll find out that a lot of them self-identify at around age 7 or so. I hear that a lot. Age 7, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I think it's because that's when we feel competent at, you know, writing a sentence. We know punctuation. And I know I wrote my first book when I was about 7 or 8. I still have it. I wrote it on cloth and bound it together. But the reason I didn't I went to medical school instead was I had a Chinese American father. And Asian immigrants, if you notice, are really big on security. Really good on, you know, they think that the most secure thing you can do is go into the sciences, which is why we have so many Chinese American doctors. So my dad convinced me that there was no living to be made as a writer, and convinced me to go to medical school. But it turned out to be, in the long run, really, really good, because I mean, medicine gave me a lot of stories, and it also gave me the background to write about doctors, and it's a big part of Maura Isles, who was my, you know, my medical examiner in the series.
Being a name and
Yes.
the type of writer you are, have you met Stephen King?
I have met Stephen King.
Yeah.
We actually played, and I was a guest musician in the Rock Bottom Remainders. We played for charity. We had a crowd of 2,000 people show up, which was really kind of embarrassing because we're not that good. And the worst part was that I played the violin. So it was like, what do I do in a rock band? I don't know. So I started to listen to the songs, and whenever the saxophone would have a piece, I would play those notes. But he's a very, very brilliant man. I mean, I don't think I've known a writer who has his IQ. And I remember sitting and having lunch with him, and we're having this normal conversation, and somebody stops and he goes, I just solved my plot problem. It turns out that while he was talking to me, another part of his brain was working on his book. Maybe I was really boring. Yes?
What does a writer do for 3 hours? Do you get in trouble when you're driving by yourself?
Oh, no, that's the best time, really. If I get writer's block, and I get writer's block all the time. Every book I've ever written, I've had writer's block. About halfway, 2/3 of the way through, because I don't know what happens next. I don't plot my stories out ahead of time, so I get to all these plot problems. And what I will do is, driving in a car is the best way to get through it. A long, long drive. I remember I had to drive in Texas once, and that was a really long drive, like 6 hours in the car. And I was having problems with the book Vanish, about the corpse who wakes up in the morgue. I had started that book where it was a man in the body bag who takes hostages in the hospital, and then I got bored with it. So I was in the car driving in Texas, and I thought, oh, I know how to fix this. Because I realized that the reason it was boring was because who takes hostages? It's always men. You know, it's just like everyday story. But if it's a woman who takes a hostage, now it suddenly becomes like really weird. There's something really wrong with the story, and it was because of that drive that it came to me. And I've heard other writers say that things like driving, traveling on a train, things where you don't have to actively think about something, your brain goes into alpha mode or whatever it is, and that gets you past writer's block. The other universal is hot water. Apparently a lot of people get a lot of ideas in the bathtub. Archimedes did, so I'm not a writer. Yes?
Do you like the differences in the series Rizzoli and Isles compared to your books?
Well, you know, in some ways, writers always think that they've done the best version, right? And so it was a little bit of an adjustment for me, because I see my stories as much darker. I see Maura Isles as being quite gloomy and almost a depressive person who has a lot of issues in her life. They chose to make the character much happier and sunnier with not a lot of personal crises. And that was something I had to get used to. I think they thought that they were looking more for glamour and for humor in the story. So it's just a different interpretation. But the important thing to me is that, you know, other people know these characters now. They know Jane and Maura, and it has brought a lot of new readers to the books. I don't let it affect my writing because I figure there are a lot of my readers who will never watch the television show, and I don't want to make any changes. Yeah. Yes?
How long does it take you to write a book, and what percentage of your time do you dedicate to writing that particular book?
It takes me however long they give me. It used to be like a year, and lately, as I'm getting older, and I have a grandchild, and I think I've got other things in life, I'm asking for 2 years per book. So it's, it probably takes me about 6 to 7 months to write a first draft, and then it takes me a couple months to revise it enough to where I'm happy enough to send it in. And that also, that year also includes a lot of publicity travel. So, for instance, this year I'm probably on the road, 2 or 3 months just on publicity. So this is, you can see why that, life gets really crazy. But because I don't have a method where I know ahead of time where my story is going, it's the rewrite period is really horrible. My husband hates to be in the house. He's like, the story keeps changing.
He doesn't mind you traveling, you're sitting on the train for a while.
No, he's used to it. The thing is, this is the other thing a writer needs, is a really understanding spouse. Because we're in the room, but we're not there. We're thinking, we're having conversations with other people. And I remember when I was writing The Surgeon, which was the first book in this series, it was about a serial killer who does horrible things to women. He got to be so real to me that I could hear his voice. I knew how he thought, and it got to the point where I would walk into the main mall and I would have his persona in my head, and I would look around and see, which one of these people would I choose as a victim? I'd feel like I was stalking. I thought, this is the way a stalker thinks, and I had to think that way because I had his character. So my husband and I would start to talk about Warren all the time. Warren this and Warren that, and ooh, there's a horrible killing on television. Warren could have done that. Or wow, look at this horrible twisted book. Warren would enjoy that. And then we went on vacation in Italy, and there was a big sign outside San Gimignano that said, "Come and visit our torture museum." And my husband said, "You know who wants to go there, don't you?" So we went to that museum because a fictional character was in the back seat demanding it, and we ended up going there. So yeah, that's your spouse has to be tolerant not only of the fact that you are dreaming up in La La Land, but there's a fictional person sitting at the dinner table with you, and he may be a killer. Yes.
Finish one book, i.e. require, and you want to go on to something that is not one. What do you have to do to purge yourself? Or do you ever?
Yeah, it does. It takes days to weeks of just doing something completely different, like gardening or playing music or something like that. And sometimes you just a book. Okay, the book I'm working on now is not a Rizzoli and Isles book. It happened because it's called Playing with Fire, and it occurred to me after I had a nightmare in Venice. I was in Venice for my birthday, and I woke up one morning just like, oh, what was that dream about? And the dream was that I was playing my violin, and there was a baby sitting next to me. And as I was playing this music, the baby's eyes glowed red, and she turned into a monster. And I thought, what the heck is that? What is that story? And then I began to walk around Venice, and I ended up in the old Jewish quarter where they had deported all their Jews to camps, and they all died. And that story, that dream, and that experience, and I came home and I wrote a story about a haunted piece of music. A woman violinist comes home from Rome with a piece of music she bought in an antique store, handwritten, and every time she plays it, her 3-year-old daughter goes berserk and does something violent, stabs her, kills the cat. So this woman has to find out, where does this music come from? Because all she has is a name. And in tracing it back, it turns out she puts herself in danger because it's related to the Italian Holocaust. And so that got me into reading about the Holocaust and finding out that Italy was a really, really different country than Germany and Poland. They were ordered to turn over their Jews, and yet 85% of Italian Jews survived. And because the Italians refused, that the police would call up the Jewish families and say, "I'm coming to arrest you tomorrow," and hang up and give them time to get out. And neighbors would hide their neighbors, and a lot of Catholic Italians got executed by the Germans for hiding Jews. So that whole story just kind of like, I was so fascinated by the difference in Italy. And that's the book I'm finishing up now. So yeah, you don't know what's going to happen. I love nightmares, actually. I find that they become very useful.
Having a grandchild, have you ever thought, how old?
She's only a year old.
Have you ever thought of doing a children's book or something for her?
A children's, no, I don't. I think it's, that would be pretty inappropriate book, I think. I could see doing young adult, because that's pretty edgy, but a children's book, I think that's a very, very specialized thing, and I don't think, not everybody can write a children's book. Yeah, I don't think anybody would want to buy my children's book. Yes?
You never thought of doing something lighter, because you have a wonderful sense of humor.
Yeah, well, when I started off doing romances, I tried to do a straight romance, and a body always showed up. So I don't know. I think it gets back to the movie theater of horror films, and I just can't get away from it. I guess I could do something sweet, but then at the end of it, I always feel like, well, there's something missing, Yeah, a murder. All right, well, thank you very much. Again, if you'd like to buy a book, you can get a free book, and I'd be happy to sign them. And just December 30th, Die Again comes out if you want to read about safari parties. And
Is that a result?
yes, it is. It's number 11. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can always ask me.
Oh, the ones, yeah. Yeah, that was quite a sight. Didn't get there the day before, because of the scrub. That was tough.